Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Network for Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series. We are extremely excited to have you here today. My name is Kat Lyons, and I work as the Network Associate for the Network for Landscape Conservation. And I'll be sharing a brief welcome from the network, introduce our speaker today, and then go through some housekeeping logistics as we go through the webinar. So a brief overview of the network. We were launched in 2011, and the Network for Landscape Conservation is the national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative landscape conservation. We really strive to connect people to ideas and innovations and to each other. And we consider the network really a community as much as an organization. And this community is connected by a shared work of collaborative landscape conservation. So today, we really strive every day to create an opportunity for this community to learn together. And for this reason, we are extremely excited to continue this webinar series throughout the fall and into the winter. So I will briefly introduce our speaker. So today we have Breece Robertson, who is the Director of Partnerships and Strategy at the Center for Geospatial Solutions at the Lincoln Institute of Land and Policy. Breece combines geospatial technology and storytelling to inspire, activate, educate, and engage people to protect our planet. She is a noteworthy leader in the conservation and parks field with over 2 decades of experience. And in her current role at the Lincoln Institute of Land and Policy, she engages with geospatial initiatives to connect partner ecosystems and guides game-changing geospatial innovation to fill critical gaps and improve upon legacy methodologies to meet ambitious land, water, climate, and equity goals. Today, Breece will discuss the vision, strategies, and resources laid out in her new book, Protecting the Places We Love, Conservation Strategies for Entrusted Lands and Parks. She will share how our community can be equipped with smart analysis and targeted action, can really identify places needing protection, and better understand how to maximize partnerships, inspire, educate, and engage communities and donors, and produce better results in a conservation world. So a few logistics, and then I will let Breece take it from here. As we listen to the presenter and today, please submit your questions in the chat and the Q&A function on Zoom. We invite you to do that throughout. Once the presenter is done, we'll be using the 15 to 30-minute remainder of time for questions and answers. And then after she's done, we'll also announce the lucky attendee who will receive her book today. And then Breece will also have a special offer that she'll share in her presentation as well. So with that, welcome, Breece, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Good.
All good. Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks, everybody, and welcome. I'm really glad that you joined today. And I thought to kick us off, I appreciate being introduced, but for some of you who don't know me, I thought it would be good to just give you a quick introduction and tell you why love for conservation and nature drives my work ethic. Let's see, advance the slide. There we go. So I grew up in rural North Carolina. Very much I had an outdoor childhood. I did a lot of exploring in the forests around my home. I did a lot of fishing. I did a lot of gardening with my grandparents and great-grandparents who had really huge gardens, more like farms. And it was really that connection to nature that gave me the inspiration to do the work that I'm doing today. It really instilled in me that love for nature, but I didn't understand the value of nature until I took a trip out west after I graduated with an undergraduate degree in exercise physiology. And at that time, a trajectory of thinking I was going to go into medical school to be an orthopedic surgeon. But I took this trip out west and I just was so enthralled with the public lands. I visited national parks, I visited national forests, BLM lands, local parks, state lands, and visited tribal lands, and really got a sense of how important these places were for both communities and nature. And so that really changed my mind for my trajectory in my career. And I went back to North Carolina and I got a degree in geography and planning from Appalachian State University. And shortly after that, I got my first dream job with the Trust for Public Land, and I was able to build their GIS planning and research unit from the ground up. And that was back in 2001, so 20 years ago. And I worked with the Trust for Public Land for almost 18 years. And with the teams that I developed there and worked with, I like to say we worked from the main streets to the mountaintops. We did a lot of neighborhood planning using GIS to cite where parks should go. We also did community conservation planning to help communities develop plans that would guide their park and open space implementation work into the future. We also worked on a lot of national projects that you might be familiar with. We were in partnership with other organizations to develop the National Conservation Easement Database, and also Park Score, which was the first park ranking system for the 100 largest city park systems in the country. And we expanded upon that to create ParkServe, which was the first local parks database that allowed communities to map and analyze park equity and access issues all across the country. So through those experiences at the Trust for Public Land, that really drove my work ethic, or developed my work ethic. Oops, let me go back there. I really believe in collaboration. I think all of our problems are much bigger than any one person or organization can solve alone. So we really need to work together to meet these big challenges. I also believe in accessibility and making data and tools widely available to as many people as possible. And inclusiveness, because I think that racial, social, and environmental justice have to be core and key to our communities to make them thriving and make them the places that we all want to live in. So fast forward to today. Today actually marks my 1-year anniversary in joining the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to co-develop the Center for Geospatial Solutions with my colleague Jeff Allenby and Scott and others. And so now I'm really focused on taking all those things that I learned at the Trust for Public Land and with the partnerships over the last many years and expanding that globally. And as Kat mentioned, I wrote a book, and it is available to all of you. Esri Press is actually giving everyone a 40% off the list price deal today and tomorrow. And you can buy the book from your local bookseller or from any of these book retailers. And it's called Protecting the Places We Love, Conservation Strategies for Entrusted Lands and Parks. Oops, let me go back there. Sorry about that. And I really wrote this book for you and for the supporters of our organizations. A lot of us are using GIS, and we might want to up our game, so to speak, and how we're using geospatial technologies and data. But a lot of organizations aren't using GIS, and there's still a lot of real or perceived barriers as to why that is. So I wanted to make this book a very accessible book, not overly technical, but has information on how to map, model, and analyze certain issues like climate change, biodiversity, park equity and access, and landscape connectivity. And this book, it has a lot of information in it around how to access data and different resources. And I'm only going to be able to cover a little bit of that in the short time we have here today. So I highly encourage you to, purchase this book for yourself or for your volunteers or your board members. If you're really trying to make the case for more geospatial capabilities and capacity within your own organizations, there's a lot of information and really inspiring stories in the book about organizations, not only within the United States, but globally, who are using GIS to tell our stories, engage communities, and prioritize and manage conservation lands effectively. But before we jump into what's in the book, I wanted to provide a little bit of context because we are in an unprecedented time where we have a lot of funding, a lot of initiatives, a lot of policies that are supporting our work or will be supporting our work. And I would argue that this year and through the next decade are the most important times within the conservation field, because we have these 30 by 30 and half Earth goals that we need to meet to avert catastrophic climate collapse and biodiversity collapse. And we also have a lot of opportunities. So we have a fully funded Land and Water Conservation Fund. We have the American Rescue Plan Act. We have some question marks now about the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and a lot of the budget reconciliation initiatives are focused on conservation, forests, all the work that we're working on. More money is being funneled into other agencies like the Department of Defense, the Sentinel Landscapes Program, and the REPI program. And then we have America the Beautiful, our first ever national goal for the stewardship of nature in America. And, it really calls out the things that are threatening our lands and waters and wildlife the most, and that is losing intact nature. We're losing that at alarming rates. You probably saw last week we've lost 23 species, and we're really looking at losing a lot more over the next years and decades. So we have to really conserve land to help protect those species and their habitat. Climate change, and also inequitable access to the outdoors. And this ties back to my personal and professional ethics. The plan specifically calls out that we must use the best available scientific information and accurate maps, along with public engagement, to really understand what decisions need to be made and what lands need to be protected in a balanced way, so that we have a lot of support for conservation moving forward. The work that we do at the local level makes a really big difference in this big, broader global context. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I work with the Santa Fe Conservation Trust as a volunteer. And we have been doing a lot of mapping work and story mapping work at the Conservation Trust. And this is just one example of a story that has emerged. This is the Galisteo Basin watershed, which is just south of Santa Fe. And the outline in blue is the Galisteo watershed boundary. And then you can see all the other land ownership types depicted here in different colors. But what I want to point out here is those purple parcels are properties that the Conservation Trust has protected through conservation easements with private landowners. And you can see that the majority of the land within this watershed boundary is private land. And private landowners and conservation easements are going to be a key part of meeting our 2030 and 2050 goals. And the Trust has conserved over 18,000 acres of land in this area. And this is a critical missing, or was a missing linkage of protected lands in this wildlife corridor that goes from the Sandia Mountains to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the north. And it provides critical passageway for mountain lions, for mule deer, for all types of species. And a lot of these properties to help to preserve water quality and quantity in this area, as well as cultural sites. There are a lot of cultural sites in this area that these lands are protecting. And you can see on the map on the left, this is the Wildlands Network, the Western Wildway. And this is a critical linkage, not only locally for Santa Fe County, but also within this broader wildway that runs from Mexico all the way to Canada. So that's a great example of how local conservation easement work feeds into a broader goal. And then diving in, even even deeper into the urban landscape. When I was at the Trust for Public Land, we worked on a lot of green schoolyards. So this is a really good example of how we could use GIS to depict areas in cities that are experiencing a lot of flooding. They're in urban heat islands, so they get much hotter in the summer because of this concrete, these impervious surfaces, and no green. And we did over 200 of these green schoolyards in New York City, and I know TPL is expanding that program nationally now. But what a difference one park in the right location can make. This particular park absorbs over 500,000 gallons of stormwater a year. It reduces the temperatures, not only in this direct area, but in the surrounding neighborhood. And the school has opened this park after hours, so it's available to everybody to use, to recreate and to socialize. So jumping into my book and some of the things that I do cover in the book. In chapter 1, I kick off with maps and how important maps are as storytelling devices to not only set the stage for communities for what needs to be protected and to get them engaged, but to also really to tell the story about conservation and what's happening in our communities, and to lead towards actionable implementation on the ground. In this particular instance, I tell the story of the Hoback Basin in Wyoming, and an oil and gas company owned a bunch of leases in this area. And they decided they wanted to move forward on building out these oil and gas pads in this pristine wilderness area. And they were going to put in many, many miles of roads, many, many gas pads. And the community decided they didn't want this to happen. But they really weren't able to come together and organize until everybody was on the same page and understood what the big threats were. And so by putting all this information on a map, showing the community, where those roads would go, what areas of their wilderness area would be impacted, it really helped to galvanize them and bring them together in a supportive way to raise the funds to be able to purchase those oil and gas leases in perpetuity. And so this is the wild and scenic Hoback River here. It's part of the Yellowstone ecosystem. It's very important habitat. So the community, by using these maps, was able to come together and raise the funds to purchase those leases to save this very beautiful and important place. And maps are really important to not only tell the story about what's going on in a place, but to document historical changes and provide a different kind of discourse for understanding issues. And this is a map by Stephanie Smith of the Grand Canyon Trust. This is in the Bears Ears National Monument area. And this is a really good example of why we have to be careful about how we use data and how we present information on maps. And working with the different tribes in the Bears Ears Coalition, partners brought maps to the table that were kind of your traditional maps, where you overlay administrative boundaries and state boundaries and base map, quote unquote, information. But when those maps were used with the tribes in these engagement meetings, the maps didn't resonate with the tribes. They didn't tell the story about the landscape in the way that the tribes live that story and the way they relate to the landscape. And so this is an example of a map that Stephanie and team created that really reflects the tribe's views of the landscape there in the Bears Ears. And so this is one of those maps that was actually used and will continue to be used to reinstate the Bears Ears National Monument. And I go much deeper into the story in the book, and so you can learn more about that there. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with story maps. That story that I told about Santa Fe Conservation Trusts, we actually turned that into a story map, and you can scroll through. The nice thing about story maps, if you don't know what they are, they're interactive maps. We call them scrolly telling maps, where you can scroll down through a story about a place or an issue. And you can integrate different multimedia into that map. So you can have interactive maps, you can have video, you can have voice, and you can have graphs and charts. It's just a great way to take a bunch of very detailed information and condense it down into a story that is accessible and relatable and inspirational to people. There's another example here of the Vermont Land Trust Recreation Map, showing all the easements and lands that the Vermont Land Trust has protected. You can click on those and get information about those. And then this application in the top right is another app from Grand Canyon Trust, where they're showing volunteer hours. So where volunteers are working on the landscape and how many hours they're using or contributing on those projects. So story maps and these interactive applications can also be a really great way to build narrative around the work that we're doing and build support. And I have a whole chapter dedicated to maps. That's chapter 1. I have a whole chapter dedicated to community engagement in the book and different strategies that we can all use to engage communities, because the communities are the ones that are living in their places. They have that deep collective knowledge about their place, and they want to be involved in these processes. And in the past, a lot of planning processes have been very restricted in some ways, and we haven't really reached all the members of the communities. And so there are a lot of different ways to do that. There are what we call speak outs, where you can show up at the local football game or the pool on Saturday morning at the rec center, or the farmers market, different events to put maps out on a table or put information out so that community members can engage and tell you what's important for conservation and parks in their community. You see here, we were working on a Taos community conservation plan, and we have some members from the Taos Pueblo that came and provided information, drew information on printed maps that we then digitized into GIS. You can also use survey applications. Those are really configurable, easy to configure out of the box applications to gather information from community members. And this is a great picture in the bottom right of Africa People and Wildlife, some of their members out in the field using applications to actually track where they're seeing predators, so that they can alert other community members about that, so they can bring in their livestock and protect their communities. So we talked a little bit about maps and storytelling. We talked a little bit about community engagement. And again, I go into much more detail about these things in the book. But every single chapter has some information about geospatial analysis. So whether that be overlaying data layers for insights, or whether that be analyzing or buffering features or modeling information. One thing that I think is important to point out with GIS, and I think one of the biggest superpowers of GIS, is how you can take different data layers and look at them in different ways for different insights. And, conservation is not its own issue within its own vacuum, if you will, or silo. So many other things play into conservation. So the GIS really allows us to take this multi-criteria or multi-benefit approach to looking at different issues, where you can overlay this data, analyze it for different insights and outcomes. Reducing the barriers to data and technology. So this is something I cover extensively in the book and point you to different resources that you can access to show you that, a lot of the data and technology is very accessible, freely accessible to all of us. So I talk about how do we find out what is available, both data and technology, and then what's authoritative too, because there's a lot of data out there. I think, all of us, well, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I feel like there's just a tidal wave of data coming out daily. How do we know what's out there? How do we know what's authoritative? And then how do we access it? And so there are a lot of different considerations for accessing data, like what types of formats are the data in? Are there licensing issues or permissions you have to consider? And then once you get it, how do you use it? Do you do an overlay analysis? Do you model with the data? How do you create a story map with that data? And then what level of expertise is needed to use the information or update it? That's a big question too. Once you create a product, whether it is a story map or a decision support tool that's online or a data set, how do we keep those things updated? And then how do we incorporate new technologies to address challenges? That's another thing that I feel like there's a tidal wave of coming out every day is new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence or machine learning or new applications for remote sensing monitoring of conserved lands. There's a lot that's out there. And I talk about a lot of these things in the book. So just an example of the images on the bottom. This is the World Database of Protected Areas on the left. That is a database that you can access online. And many communities actually now have these GeoHubs or open data portals. So those are two good places, or one good place to start is to look to see if your local community has their data readily available through these open data portals. And as I mentioned, there's so much data out there that's available for free. One of the issues is a lot of times the data they live on different servers, they're in what I call silos. So you have to go find the data, access it, pull it out into whatever, geospatial application you're using to analyze that data. But a lot of these applications, can provide great insights for where conservation, how to prioritize conservation, and where lands are threatened and how to help prioritize implementation, management, and monitoring of conserved lands. So the USDA, U.S. Forest Service, just put out their version of the wildfire hazard potential. The EPA has a couple of different products. Their environmental justice or EJ screen combines demographic and environmental data for stakeholders to access to make decisions around environmental justice issues. TBL has the ParkServe database that's readily available where you can see in this map in bright red where the park need areas are in cities all over the country. EPA also has the Environmental Atlas, which is data that shows ecosystem services. And this one has a lot of information too on health indicators and all types of information like land cover, energy potential. So, and then there are also products that you can access where stakeholders have already come together and gone through a prioritization analysis that show high priority areas for conservation in a region, a state, or locally. So it's always worth, like the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint, it's always worthwhile to do a search on what might be available to you locally. If you don't know about the Nature Conservancy's Resilient Land Mapping tool, this one is a very powerful tool to look at climate, where species are going to be able to thrive throughout climate change, and looking at terrestrial resilience. They also have some coastal resilience data layers and some connectivity information in this platform. And NatureServe has released their Maps of Biodiversity Importance, or Mobi data. they've taken data that was at a very large scale, and they've taken it down to a scale that we can use to inform more local planning and conservation efforts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those two data sets. So this is an example, and I think a very powerful example of how simply overlaying different data sets that are available out there to us can have a really big impact. So this is that NatureServe Mobi data, and what we did here is they took the top 10% of habitats for imperiled species. So that's what's showing up here in yellow. So basically, this is where species are the most threatened for extinction in our country right now. Then they overlaid protected areas. So those are the areas in green. So you can see what is already protected of those top 10% of habitats. And then they overlaid conservation easements. I'm going to toggle on this one a little bit so you can see conservation easements showing up here. Conservation easements, private land conservation, is just can't state enough how important of a tool that is to meet our conservation goals. And then this next map shows the TNC resilient and connected landscapes. And there are a lot of different categories here for those landscapes, but NatureServe actually combined them all into one layer. So this layer represents all of the connected and resilient lands. And then I'm going to zoom in and show you what this really looks like on a more of a site level. So we're going to zoom into Georgia and look at the same information into this southeast Georgia along this river. So again, this is the imperiled species data overlaid with protected lands. So you can see that not much of this is actually protected right now by publicly protected lands. And these are GAP 1 and 2 lands, for those of you who are familiar with the data. And then if I overlay conservation easements, you can see conservation easements are making a really big difference in protecting a lot of this habitat along these two river corridors. And then we also overlay the TNC connected and resilient lands. So again, you can see when you start to overlay all these different data layers, what the importance is of both publicly protected and privately protected lands, but also how much more work we need to do here. And this is where, at this point, you could overlay parcel data, you could overlay farmland, prime farmland data. This is where you could really start to overlay other data and information to get insights on what's threatened and to help inform strategies for land protection in these areas. Oh, and then we also overlaid high ecological valued forest here. So you can just really start to see the overlay of all these different layers and what's protected and what's not, and help guide our conservation decisions and strategies. And NatureServe was also able to, with their data, show exactly for specific parcels what species, or actually that's not for parcels, that's for areas, what species we will be protecting if we protect those areas. So very powerful data. And again, this is freely available to everyone. If you can access it, pull it into GIS to do your own overlay analyses, or work with other partners if you don't have GIS to help integrate some of these data layers into your conservation plans. So I have another chapter in the book that is specifically focused on mapping landscape connectivity. And I go into detail in this chapter about what is landscape connectivity and all the different partners that are working on this in the United States. And I showcase a lot of maps like this one from the South Coast Wildlands. So again, there are a lot of efforts that are happening right now where different organizations are working on national and international connectivity maps that can really be used to drive conservation strategies for conserving lands, for wildlife corridors. And I know the Center for Large Landscape Conservation is working on one of those. They just announced it last week that they'll be working on that, and hopefully it'll be out soon for partners to use to identify conservation corridors in the areas that we work in. But there are also a lot of regional and local conservation connectivity maps. So this is one from the South Coast Wildlands in Southern California, showing linkages between the Santa Monica and Sierra Madre mountains. This is a map that is in the southern part of New Mexico and Arizona, looking at Mexican wolf connectivity corridors. This was created by the Wildlands Network and Bird's Eye View GIS. So a lot of examples of connectivity out there, more to come on that. But in the book, I do cover quite a few of the partners that are working in that space and go into detail on the different methods that they're using for mapping connectivity. So now switching gears, so we talked about telling our stories, engaging the community, some high-level analytics like overlay analysis, and then also freely available tools, data, and resources that we can access for our conservation work. And then there's also an emerging set of tools and applications and data sets that are more accessible and available around Earth observation and remote sensing for managing and monitoring our lands. And these slides are from Upstream Tech, and they focus on making technology very accessible. So you don't have to be a GIS expert. You don't have to have any experience in GIS at all, actually, to use their platform. But they're really focused on using remote sensing information for better insights into the past and present of protected lands, reducing the cost of stewardship. So you can use this remote sensing data to look at lands on your computer screen and see, have there been any changes to those lands? And if so, what are they? And, that could actually spur you to send people out into the field to check out what's going on those properties. So here's an example of some of the different data types that you can access through their platform. You can access, they make it really easy. In the past, you had to go find the right remote sensing imagery. You had to understand how to access that data, how to analyze it, how to use it, how to interpret that data. And what they do in their platform is it's a one-stop shop. So you go there, you can figure out what kind of satellite imagery you need, for what purposes. You can easily purchase that through their platform for a much reduced cost. And you can do your monitoring through their platform. And I'll talk a little bit more about reporting in a minute. But this is a great example of before and after a wildfire in California, showing tree cover, vegetation cover, and how the fire changed this particular landscape. And then you can also access climate-related data like canopy cover, canopy layer count, surface fuels. So there's a lot of information that remote sensing data can give us, and then platforms and applications like Upstream. Esri has some new tools that are out, and there are others as well that could help us with this remote monitoring work. So what that really leads to is more of a digital first or data first approach to managing and monitoring our lands that can really help us be more efficient, less paperwork, more transparency, and actually have a string of continuity between how we're looking at and managing and monitoring our conservation lands. And then some of the other new developments out there, my last chapter of the book is about the road ahead and on the horizon. What are some of these new technologies that are coming out? in the AI, artificial intelligence realm or machine learning realm. And one of those that I'm really excited about is the anonymized mobility data. And what you're seeing in the top left-hand corner, this is a park in Newark, New Jersey, the Riverfront Park. And these little dots are showing where people are coming from to visit this park over a certain time period. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the park there in the middle, and it's showing, you can click on these census block groups around the park to see how many people are coming from those specific census block groups to visit the park over a certain time period. And then they have some algorithms to figure out how many, or what the demographic socioeconomic profile of these people are that are coming to the park. And then you can also drill all the way down into the park itself and see, these are the yellow areas are park or cell phone pings. Actually this data comes from the apps that we use on our cell phones. It doesn't actually come from the cell phone GPS or the cell phone data itself. It comes from apps using the cell phone. But the yellow areas are pings of people who use that park over a 2-month period in this case. So you can really start to see not only where are people coming from, but where do they go after they visit a park, and then what amenities are they using in a park the most, and what areas are they not using, why is that? So this type of data I think is really going to help unlock a lot of insights into who's using public lands, how they flow, where they go to when they're in a public land or a park, and provide us insights that can help us do better management, support our budgeting needs, support the need for more parks and open spaces, or maybe even renovated parks that aren't currently being used. So a lot of applications for this type of data moving into the future. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up here. I see we have some questions coming in, but I wanted to just give you a few quick start resources. And again, in the book, there's so many resources in the book that can point you to many more places to find data, to find the right technologies, to use applications that are readily available online. But Learn ArcGIS Hub is a really great place to start. These are free Learn lessons. Some are 15 minutes, some are an hour and a half, depending on what you want to do. But you can go create your own story map by going through a 30-minute Learn lesson on ArcGIS Hub. So that's a really good resource. And if you're looking for a data repository, ArcGIS Living Atlas of the World is also a really good resource. And I'm sure you all have resources too. Feel free to put those in the chat so we can share them with everybody. But with that, I will say again that I'm really glad that you joined, and I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions, and really honored to share my book with you. And again, it's Esri's making it available for 40% off to all of you who are attending this webinar. So with that, I will stop there and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Breece. It was great to learn from you. We do have a couple questions in the chat. I'm gonna drop the link again to the book. So if anyone has any issues or questions, feel free to reach out. But the first question that came up, and I will just word for word read this for you, Breece. So if you need me to send it in the chat, let me know.
Okay.
But one attendee said, I'm working with a coalition thinking about 30 by 30 goals in Colorado. We know that gap level 1 and 2 lands meet the 30 by 30 goals. We are trying to figure out what other lands qualify. For example, do national forest roadless areas qualify? And do conservation easements only qualify if they're in perpetuity? And do you have any advice for us?
Hey, Allison, first of all, great to hear from you. These are all really good questions, and they're still being grappled with right now, honestly, both at on, obviously at a statewide level, but a national and an international level. The IUCN just put out a paper called What Counts 30 by 30, and I'm not going to be able to access that link right now, but I think if you Google that, or maybe Kat, if you could Google it and find it and put it into the chat, they have some guidance from that international level on what counts. And so high level, they're saying, whatever a country considers protected lands, that counts. But then there's also this OECM, other areas that are managed for conservation purposes, that those should count too. There's not a definitive definition for those yet, though. And so there's a lot of work to be done on this. And I know that, there are committees that are working on it at the international scale, but also here in the United States. And this question just came up last week. I joined the Salzar Symposium, and Deb Haaland spoke, the Secretary of the Department of Interior, and she got the same question. And, it is obvious that there are a lot of organizations working on it, but we don't have those answers quite yet. I mean, my guess is we're going to have to come up with that really soon. This is a big problem. We have a baseline accounting issue, not only in our country, but globally right now. And we need to know, what's protected. But there's a saying, preserve the best and improve the rest. And, I think regardless of these numbers that scientists have come up with, 30% or 50%, we need strategies to be able to identify, well, what are those best lands in our communities, and what are the ones that we need to improve? And so there's a lot of work to be done there. And my team at CGS is involved in those conversations, and I'm sure probably some of you are as well. Sorry, I don't have a definitive answer there, but I'd love to connect with you, Allison, on that.
Thanks so much, Breece. Another question just came in. So often GIS software is very expensive, especially for personal use. So are there some low-cost options for map viewing and minor annotation that you suggest?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Esri makes GIS available to individuals for personal use now for $100 a license. So, that still might be out of range for some people, but look into that. I'm pretty sure that's still an available option. There's also ArcGIS Online, and they have a personal account use there that you can access for free. But if you're working with other organizations that have GIS licenses, there are ways that those organizations can give you different level of licensing for ArcGIS Online. So for example, they can give you a creator license if they have enough of those to share, so that you can create story maps yourself. So there are a couple of other options there. And I guess I should say I'm focusing mainly on Esri and the ArcGIS suite of products, because that is what I have used throughout my career. You also have other products like Google Earth Engine, and some of these other freely available freemium versions of products that are out there.
Great, thank you so much. And I know a couple of folks added some suggestions as well in the chat. So continue to add those suggestions if you think of any options.
Great. Oh yes, QGIS is, thanks Katie for that. QGIS was used in the map of the Mexican gray wolf connectivity analysis by Kurt Minke at Bird's Eye View, and that is free. So there is a free open source GIS option there.
Great, awesome. So I will ask another question from the chat. And I will read this word for word so you can kind of get the context, Breece, but it's also in the chat. So there's less of a focus on the mapping tools, but it feels like there's a lot of private lands that are for sale, especially in agriculture land or empty lots in forested ecosystems. So this attendee is wondering, what can people, including conservationists that don't work on land protection, do to aid in private land protection? Sometimes it is depressing seeing a lot of acres out there and land for sale, and then it ends up being developed.
Yeah, I totally agree. Especially during COVID, I was kind of shocked that, the direction of land sales went. I was hoping that development would kind of halt or, be decreased during COVID, and the absolute opposite thing has happened. So I think, well, one of the things, I'll just tell you another story about what we're doing with the Conservation Trust for Santa Fe. Um, a lot of people, in fact, I'd say most people in this country don't even know what a conservation easement is, and that land trusts are there specifically to work with private landowners to help conserve their lands. So I think the more we can use like story maps and information to get or to help people understand that easements are a real tool that are very important for land conservation, that is one way to do that. We really need to get more people informed about conservation easements as a conservation tool. But with the trust, one of the things that we're working on is even engaging in it with a land trust to do that initial assessment on your land to see if you can put an easement on it is very expensive. I mean, it can be $50,000 for, a 20-acre parcel or 50-acre parcel. So, I think that what we're doing with the trust is we're actually doing some mapping work to identify large ranches or large land holdings that are owned by people that are land rich but cash poor, so to speak, and would never be able to put an easement on their land because they just can't afford that upfront cost. And so we're using mapping to identify those people so that then the land trust can go and do outreach and education to those property owners, and then also work with donors to raise the funds to pay for those upfront costs so that those landowners don't have to incur those, and so that that's not a barrier to private landowners to engage. And then there's a lot of conversations going on about the size of easements, because like easements, you can't put an easement on certain acreages or certain acreage sizes. It has to be a certain threshold. And so what can we do to bring those land acreage thresholds down? So there's a lot of work to be done on that. But, I just joined the Land Trust Alliance rally this week, and land trusts are doing amazing work to get the word out there about conservation easements.
That's great. This is kind of similar question from another attendee. We brought up the importance of landscape connectivity and wildlife corridors, but you mentioned a lot of the examples in the presentation where we focus on small private lands in and around cities and towns, or large public lands and open spaces like state and national parks and forests. If it seems that there is a missing middle of farms, ranches, private forests that could be brought in to improve the overall quality of the land matrix around these areas. So what strategies would you suggest to include rural working lands and conservation equation? So somewhat similar to what you were answering.
Yeah. I didn't talk about that in this presentation, but I talked quite a bit about farmlands and that sort of suburban, rural, area where conservation is just really important. And I think there's a chapter in the book on strategic conservation planning, and I think that's really important to capture that variety of lands from the city center out to the rural areas to wilderness areas. If communities are in places that have wilderness areas as well. But going through a comprehensive strategic conservation plan that is community driven is a really powerful way to make sure that all of those places are showing up on the map, so to speak, as places that are either threatened and need to be protected, or maybe they don't need a perpetual protection, but they need some kind of improvement or new management strategy. So conservation planning processes, I think, are a really powerful way to make sure we're accounting for all those different land types.
That's great. Thank you so much. Another thing that you talked about in the conversation was engaging local stakeholders in mapping processes. And how do you find that all these strategies talk about speak outs, talk about surveys, and potentially individuals tracking their own backyards to input that data? So what have you found that works really well kind of in that rural side and community driven side? Are events a good space? And what other strategies have you used on your projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. We called our community-driven conservation planning processes green printing at TPL. And we did a lot of work in rural communities in Idaho and Colorado and the Northeast, like in Maine. And what we did is we made sure, and here we are on the Network for Landscape Conservation webinar, we made sure that we were engaging networks. So, for example, here in Colorado, you'd want to think about engaging networks of farmers or ranchers that are already working together, like Cattle Growers Association. So through the process of doing strategic planning, we identified all those different groups that already had engaged memberships or networks or partnerships, that we could make sure that they were at the table during these conservation planning processes and that their members knew about what was going on too and had that opportunity. So that's one way, just really from a more planning standpoint. The story maps, I think too, can be powerful if you can create story maps and that you create in conjunction with these networks. And then they already have this infrastructure in place to connect with their different members, so they can push the information out that way.
Great. Thank you so much, Breece. So we're almost at the top of the hour. So I just wanted to do a bit of a wrap up from the network side, and also announce who won the book. So Nicole Reese has won the book from Breece. So if you haven't already shared your email, we will be in touch and we'll get your information so we can send that book on your way. And then please don't forget that there is that 40% discount on Breece's book. I think as we can see, there's a lot in there and a lot of different tools and strategies that can help on our everyday work. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to Breece for letting us learn from you today. It was a great honor. And also thank you to all who attended. We're extremely grateful for all of your participation in the series, and we look forward to having you in future conversations. And please continue to engage with the Network for Landscape Conservation. So this webinar is a part of the ongoing Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series, and a recording of this webinar will be posted on the network website. So questions and things that we didn't get to, you can still see those. And then you can access this webinar and past webinars there. And then please look out for future announcements of webinars. And I will drop the link to that right now for our website. And in addition, we do have a webinar coming up at the end of this month on October 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And we'll have Juan Carlos Bravo, the Mexico Program Director for the Wildlands Network, share the challenges and opportunities of land protection in Mexico to address the obstacles of connectivity at a regional scale. To also be sharing how they fill gaps in knowledge through collaborative field research and their efforts to conserve the Arizona Sonora borderlands landscape. So thank you all again for your participation. We really hope that you have a great rest of your day, and please continue to reach out to us if you have any questions or ideas on new webinars. Thank you all.
All right, thanks everybody.